Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Friday, October the 10th, 2025. Today there is a conjunction between the Moon and Uranus. It's not a particularly unusual aspect. It takes place every month, once every lunar cycle, but it can be important, and I thought it would be a good idea to look at this Moon-Uranus conjunction in some detail. But before I do that, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Friday, October the 10th, 2025. So here is the chart for today, set for noon, New York time, and you can see that the moon is at 6 degrees Gemini on this Friday. So the moon goes into Gemini 6:12 a.m. if you're in London, sort of a bit later if you're in Europe. That would be maybe late afternoon if you're in Australasia. If you're in California, well, in fact, the moon would have gone into Gemini late on Thursday. So, moon in Gemini, I think you could argue it's sort of quite useful to have the moon in Gemini. It provides a bit of positivity to the chart. You've only got Sun in Libra, in terms of fire and air elements, and now that the Moon is in Gemini, you've got another planet in an air sign. Now you could say, oh well, Uranus is in Gemini, Pluto's in Aquarius, but these are transpersonal planets. So when doing the elemental calculations, I don't really count them. So Moon in Gemini does create a bit of space and creates some flexibility, some action. Action, of course, on a mental level. It's not like the moon is going into a fire sign, but we can have sort of ideas, even if we can't necessarily see them through. And the moon does make, yes, it makes a conjunction to Uranus, and it makes a trine to Pluto. So the moon conjunct Uranus maybe is the most important aspect today. It's a reminder that it's a reminder that Uranus is in Gemini. Now there is one more Moon-Uranus conjunction in a month's time, and then by the one after that, which would be beginning of December, something like that, the moon will have gone back into Taurus, and that is a reminder that Uranus is going retrograde and it's not going to be in Gemini forever. So maybe with Uranus going into Uranus going back into Taurus, I was thinking about that. Perhaps America, the United States, will be able to step down from war footing, I hope. But, we shouldn't forget that, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Uranus was in Taurus. So just because Uranus is not in Gemini doesn't mean that America can't involve itself in a major war. But maybe Uranus moving out of Gemini, out of the sign of the United States' descendant, perhaps some of the pressure will temporarily ease. But I'm not entirely convinced. But that might be just something we need to be thinking about, the fact that Uranus is about to go back into Taurus. But as far as today is concerned, Uranus is still very much in Gemini, and so with that Moon-Uranus conjunction, it's possible that things can happen, and things can happen a couple of hours either side of that conjunction. It is a very brief aspect, because the moon goes fast. I don't know what orb you should use for a Moon-Uranus conjunction, probably no more than a few degrees. So you take the exact time of Moon-Uranus conjunction, and then you go 3 hours before, 3 hours after, 3 hours, maybe 6 hours, 6 hours before, 6 hours after, as sort of a window where you might see the moon and Uranus having an impact. I will try in the description, or perhaps in the pinned comment, to tell you what time the Moon-Uranus conjunction is in various time zones. So that's Moon and Uranus, and then the Moon is, making a trine to Pluto, which again, it's a fairly brief aspect. It kind of brings together the Uranus-Pluto trine, and Uranus-Pluto trine, I think, is a time where many of us want to break free. I mean, it is a very collective energy, and it may be saying something about what's going on in a global sense. People wanting their freedom, not wanting to be restricted and restrained, especially as right now Saturn is square the Jupiter-Uranus midpoint. So Saturn square the Jupiter-Uranus midpoint. Well, Jupiter-Uranus is the principle of freedom, wanting to break free of something. And then Saturn is representative of everything that could be holding us back. Now, just giving you an objective view of what Saturn on a Jupiter-Uranus midpoint might be, because I think it's very close right now, Saturn square the Jupiter-Uranus midpoint. And Reinhold Ebertin says about that configuration, Saturn on a Jupiter-Uranus midpoint, the tendency at times to have sudden inhibitions, one-sided principles, obstinacy, the occurrence of sudden inhibitions before the attainment of an objective, sudden disadvantages, losses. So, Ebertin is a bit pessimistic about Saturn on the Jupiter-Uranus midpoint. Although you could say with Saturn on the Jupiter-Uranus midpoint, it is the awareness that one wants to be free, and also being aware of everything that is holding us back. And that could give us the impetus to create change. And one other minor aspect to point out is the fact that the Moon is sesquiquadrate the Sun, and that's just a reminder, of where we are in terms of the sort of lunar phases. So, here's the Moon in Gemini. There's the Sun in Libra. They're sort of roughly in sesquiquadrate. So we had the full Moon, a few days ago, and today particularly as the Moon is conjunct Uranus, there may be just a small feeling of agitation. Where is this all going? We know that the lunar cycle we're in is past peak. We now know or are afraid that things are starting to run down, and if we haven't got it together now, when are we going to get it together? Okay, we could wait until the last quarter moon. That's an absolute final chance, but some of us with this Moon conjunct Uranus may just feel that something has to happen. If it doesn't happen, it's going to be too late. And because of that, we might want to raise the stakes, or we might just want to do something just to show that we're here and we are ready for action. But maybe it's going to be difficult, and so that could create an atmosphere of sort of nervous tension and perhaps frustration as well, because you shouldn't forget there is one other aspect I did talk about a lot yesterday when I was doing my horoscope for Thursday, and that is the Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn. Now that Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn, what day is that on? Well, it could be Thursday, could be Friday. That means that this Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn is still very much in operation, and with that Mars Saturn sesquiquadrate, it can be a frustrating influence, and it may be difficult to get things together. We may get annoyed, and we may find ourselves dwelling on some of the more sort of difficult and problematic aspects of our lives and other people's lives. And in certain situations, Mars semi-square sesquiquadrate Saturn can encourage us to think about sort of death and the end of things. So there could be a bit of gloom with that Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn, but then maybe Moon in Gemini conjunct Uranus is trying to break free from that gloom and show us, what actually is possible. And then there is a picture from Australia. So if we set the chart October the 10th, 2025 to noon in Sydney, Australia, as a representative of Australasia and East Asia, the moon is at 27 Taurus. So the moon doesn't go into Gemini until sort of late afternoon, or even early evening. So if you are in Australasia, then moon in Gemini, moon conjunct Uranus, it's not perhaps going to be so important in the sort of the main part of the day, and it may only sort of start to cut in sort of later on. So there is going to be some difference of emphasis if you're in Australia or New Zealand, and perhaps things are going to be more downbeat. Perhaps you're going to feel the Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn more than if you're in, say, the United States. And then there is the heliocentric view with the Sun at the center of the solar system. And now that Mars-Uranus opposition, which I've been going on and on about, is pretty much exact. And we've actually got Venus starting to form a T-square. So there's the Mars opposition Uranus. Venus is at 25 Leo. It's starting to make that a square to Mars, starting to make a square to Uranus. And so over the next few days, because of Venus, it may be that Mars-Uranus opposition is going to really kick in even after it becomes exact. So that might be more about the weekend and maybe the beginning of next week. It's difficult to keep track of Venus and to know quite how fast it's moving, because heliocentric Venus does move faster than geocentric Venus. So the Mars-Uranus aspect could be especially strong over the next few days, and so that can represent just events, things that may not be desirable, people being too hasty, being in too much of a hurry, thinking they want instant results. And of course, if you want instant results, you can get instant problems. And Mercury is making a trine to Chiron, and it's a relatively gentle aspect. It's only a trine, but if we want to stand out, if we want to say something unusual, something that maybe rocks the boat, then yeah, we can if we want. But I wouldn't worry too much about Mercury trine Chiron. Mercury's also trining the Earth. I mean, let's get this straight. So Mercury is starting to move towards a trine of Chiron, but Mercury trine the Earth, well, that's a different matter. Mercury trine the Earth it is still a gentle aspect, but it may allow some of us to be open about our thoughts and our ideas. And if we've got something to say, especially now that the moon is moving into Gemini, making a conjunction to Uranus, maybe now is a time when we can really tell people what we think. Perhaps we've been holding back, and now might be our chance. It's what perhaps people want. So now let me turn to the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Friday, October the 10th, 2025. Aries, you still feel, I think, a sense of frustration. You can't do everything you want to do. There are many things you would like to happen, and you feel that action is needed, but are you able to see it through? Now, one problem is that we've got Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn. We had Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn yesterday. It's still around, and so Mars represents you. Sesquiquadrate Saturn represents, well, everything holding you back. So many things you would like to do, and you might regard that as being just a complete negative, but it's not a complete negative. Perhaps you hadn't thought things through. There were just things you now have to deal with. You might not want to deal with them, but you possibly don't have a choice. And when we talk about dealing with things, I'm not necessarily just talking about things at sort of material level, just organizing yourself, arranging things properly. It's also about psychological preparation. Aries has a reputation for being quite a fearless sign. And with this Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn, you may be confronting some of your fears. There is always the psychological dimension to consider. And there may be reasons why you just feel you can't do what you would like to do. So you kind of hold back. Now, are you right to hold back? Perhaps, but you mustn't take it too far. Just because something hasn't worked and didn't work in the past, even the distant past, doesn't mean it's not going to work again. So, it's good to relate to the past, to think about what did happen in the past, to look at your own behavior in the past, but you don't want the past to completely condition the future. And also, Aries, you at the moment, you do have a great desire to be free. You don't want to be stuck. And so the question is, what are you going to be able to do to break free? And that is a worthy aim. But if you just do it, in the first way that comes to mind, without thinking it through, you're not going to really get very far. And, perhaps at the moment, Aries, you need to think about things at a more sort of intellectual level, mental level. Firstly, you've got to think about it, maybe talk about it, discuss it, you create plans, play with ideas. It's not something that Aries always wants to do. Aries can be very impatient with ideas, with people talking too much. And you want some evidence that something really is happening, and you've got to make that first move. But sometimes that first move is unnecessary. It won't necessarily get you very far, and instead you have to just allow things to take their time and talk about them, because if you talk about things, you get an idea about what other people are saying. But also Aries, don't forget that Mars is in Scorpio, and I can talk about talking, but Mars in Scorpio, are you in the mood for talking? There's a lot you want to keep back. You might know that in theory you should be open and honest, but right now there is stuff you're keeping back, I think. And the question is it a good idea to keep it back? Well, it quite possibly. We may be talking about a situation where the key action should be taking place not necessarily at a mental level, but at an emotional level. Perhaps you need to give yourself time to really think things through and sort of work out where it's all going. And so maybe Aries, you shouldn't be in a hurry, and you certainly shouldn't be trying to create explosive effects. You might want to create explosive effects, and it would get everyone's attention, but I think the long-term consequences wouldn't necessarily work in your favor. Taurus, you are perhaps changing gear. The moon is out of Taurus, it's out of your sign, or it's moving out of your sign. It kind of depends where you are. If you're in Australia or New Zealand, the moon will be in Taurus for most of the day. But still, we're in a sort of a changeover period, and so you shouldn't necessarily feel that it's all down to you. That it's down to you, for example, to take the initiative, be the one to start things. No, you don't have to do that, and you don't have to get worked up about anything. In fact, the less worked up you get, the better. And try, if you possibly can, just to allow the words and the actions that are swirling all around you to just wash over you, not to be impacted by it. There are words. People are saying things. Moon's moving into Gemini. Moon's making a conjunction to Uranus. That can be quite agitating. But does it matter? You should know that words are words, that they don't mean much. and you shouldn't. Yeah, you shouldn't make any assumptions in terms of what someone says, even if they sound very serious. They're absolutely sure that they're right, and they might be saying things that upset you. They might be expressing opinions you don't approve of, but it shouldn't bother you. People can change, especially when the moon is in Gemini. When the moon is in Gemini, words can be really, very cheap. Now, the moon is also making a trine to Pluto. Now, you could say that the moon trine to Pluto is, just as important as the moon's conjunction to Uranus. Particularly if you're a Taurus, and this moon trine Pluto could be very practical. Could be about what you are trying to get together. Perhaps we're talking about money or your ambitions, and Taurus, you are a very determined person, and it's possible that you can get what you want without necessarily having to make too much of an effort. And so Taurus, okay, we've talked about words perhaps being cheap, but the right words can be effective. And if you want to sort of generally talk about something that you maybe want, so if there's something you want, particularly of a material or financial nature, I think there's a good chance you can get it, but you have to talk about it in the right way. And when you are communicating, really make a special effort to be ever so slightly disinterested. If someone gets the impression that you really want something and you're really pushy about it, they probably won't give it to you. But on the other hand, if you take a more relaxed approach, you just mention things in passing, and if someone says no, you don't get upset about it. You say, fine, well, we can talk about it later. Having a distance in the way you communicate, not a vagueness, but just a distance, a sort of a disinterest. I think that you're going to be more effective than you would be if you seem to be really obsessed. I mean, that can be difficult. I mean, it almost seems counterintuitive. You think that if you want something, you should be very clear about it. You don't want to be vague. You should ask for things directly. But, I'm suggesting that, right now, that might not necessarily, be the right approach. And continuing on the theme of money, it's important to be flexible. Things might be occurring to you about money that maybe hadn't occurred to you before, and perhaps your assumptions about money need to be reconsidered, and you might have got something wrong, or you'd misunderstood something. So don't feel that your plans about money or material things are set in stone. They can be changed, and they can be changed, quite suddenly. Now, as far as relationships are concerned, yesterday I talked about a sesquiquadrate between Mars and Saturn, and this Mars-Saturn sesquiquadrate is still there. Mars is still in Scorpio. It's still in your opposite sign. And so this Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn, when it comes to relationships, might not be particularly helpful. It could be that someone is dragging their feet, is just refusing to compromise, is refusing to listen. They're not taking into account your viewpoint. Even if it's not about your viewpoint, it just could be about someone who is not in a great mood. And so, the question is, how do you deal with this situation if this situation occurs? Particularly if there's something you want. And it goes back to what I was saying. You don't want to give the impression that anything is desperately important to you, because if you do give that impression, as I think I've already suggested, that just encourages the other person to sort of, shut up shop. They're not going to cooperate. They don't want to listen. People don't want to budge. And so that reminds you that, the more reasonable you can be, the more open and flexible and disinterested, then the better, because that just might be the best way of getting through to people and getting people in the end to do what you want. Gemini. Moon is making a conjunction to Uranus. This is the headline aspect for today. Now, this Moon-Uranus conjunction, it's quite short-lived. I mean, in terms of its exactitude, and so it can, it's moon. Yeah, the moon does go very quickly. But I mean, I think one can allow 6 hours either side. Perhaps even more. So as far as the Moon-Uranus conjunction itself is concerned, well, it takes place. Let me just tell you exactly when it takes place. Well, it takes place at sort of so when does it take place? I should know. So it takes place at 8:48 a.m. London time. So, if you're in the Americas, it does happen quite early in the morning. So, so by the time you get up and you're in the flow of the day, the Moon-Uranus conjunction is losing some of its impact. But still, Moon-Uranus are in the same sign, and I think it's going to continue even in the Americas, even in California, up until lunchtime. In other parts of the world, I think that you can regard the Moon-Uranus conjunction as very very much an important part of the day. Certainly in Europe, maybe in later in the day in Australia or New Zealand, but it's still there. And this Moon-Uranus conjunction does say something about you, and the fact that the Moon has gone into your sign, is going into your sign, and it's always good to have the Moon in Gemini, if you're a Gemini, because it makes things more exciting. It encourages you to think and to do things, and at least to think things. And with Moon conjunct Uranus, you may want to be original in some way. Now, Uranus, as we know, is in Gemini. And of course, when the Moon makes a conjunction to Uranus, it really emphasizes Uranus in your sign. This is a reminder that it is a time, Gemini, when you need to be original, when you need to do things differently, where you need to stand out as someone who is original. It's just not a time to just follow the crowd. Now, Uranus is going to leave Gemini next month. Now, there is one more Moon-Uranus conjunction in Gemini at the beginning of November. So, you get it again. But when the December Moon-Uranus conjunction, when does that take place? Moon-Uranus conjunction that takes place, I don't know, something like the 4th, 5th of December. That's in Taurus. So perhaps you need to get it together. You want to make the most of Uranus and Gemini, and then Uranus goes into Taurus. You perhaps temporarily missed your chance, although don't worry, next year Uranus goes back into Gemini. But this Moon-Uranus conjunction just reminds you of what it's all about. It reminds you that you do have to do your best to do things differently. The old ways don't necessarily work, especially as the Moon is also making a trine to Pluto. So Moon trine Pluto, you don't have to be satisfied with second best. You don't have to be satisfied with the old solutions. And, some of your ideas have perhaps got a bit stale. It can happen. Geminis, of course, pride themselves with being sort of up to date and being innovative and having cutting edge views of the world. And, you don't want to get stale. Because remember, one of the worst things you can ever say to a Gemini, speaking as someone who has got their sun in Gemini, is to tell a Gemini they're boring or they're behind the times. That's just not what Geminis want to hear. So, do make the most of it and be ready to see things, in a different way. And, don't forget perhaps the spiritual dimension. There is a biquintile between Mercury and Neptune. And so, Mercury is 144 degrees from Neptune. And so you're trying to bring something into play. You're trying to bring Neptune into play. And, what would that mean? I mean, Mercury biquintile Neptune, Mercury in Scorpio biquintile Neptune, you could say that it might work like this. Mercury is in Scorpio. Mercury is perhaps in Scorpio about preparation, hard work, really concentrating on the details. And, I'm sort of thinking about the details required to create a spiritual effect. And there's almost something quite magical about that. If you've ever sort of flick through, I don't know, a grimoire, the Key of Solomon, for example. Key of Solomon was this sort of magical work, and it tells you how to summon up spirits and to do this kind of thing. And it all sounds great. You just buy this book. You can probably get it from, I'm sure you can get it from Amazon, and you just summon up spirits. It's just easy, isn't it? But of course, the reality is that if you look at what you have to do with the Key of Solomon or some other magical treatise, I'm not encouraging you, by the way, to get involved in magic. I mean, it can be quite dangerous. It's just that you have to really make everything yourself. If you want to use the ritual sword, you can't just, again, buy your sword online. You have to make it yourself, and everything has to be made yourself. And the more effort you put in, the better. Again, I'm not encouraging you to go down that road. Instead, I'm just using that as an example to show that if you want to find some kind of spiritual satisfaction, if you want to sort of evidence that there is something beyond the material, it requires effort. But the trouble is, you've got this problem there, but it requires effort. But then, as Aleister Crowley says, you've got the lust for results. So you put all this effort, you have this lust for a result, but because you want something to happen, and certainly this is, I think, the truth with sort of magic and even spirituality, because you want something to happen, nothing happens. So somehow you have got to work towards your goals, whatever they might be, but particularly the spiritual goals. And, willpower really does matter. And from a sort of a magical point of view, you've got to have the will, and you've got to have the concentration. And so that could be how the quintile works. But it's Mercury biquintile Neptune, and so you can't have too much will because it's all very Neptunian. But if you somehow are able to get the balance right and concentrate on the kind of spiritual effects that you are looking for, and you are able to do it right, then I think that you can be successful. But when we're talking about spiritual effects, you cannot really sort of to bootstrap your own karma. You can't just sort of accelerate your spiritual and magical development. You can't just do it like that. You've got to be ever so subtle. And I'm just telling you that this Mercury biquintile Neptune is interesting, and I don't know what you want to do with Mercury quintile Neptune. Probably you want to do nothing with it. I'm just saying that there are perhaps ways in which you can enhance your spirituality and enhance your spiritual sort of awareness, and perhaps get in touch with something. And you shouldn't be sort of necessarily looking for sort of physical results, but perhaps in your own way you can sort of quietly get closer to realizing something. Cancer. Moon is now moving into Gemini, and it's making a conjunction to Uranus. It was great when the Moon was in Taurus. I hope Moon was exalted in Taurus, and it was making a trine to Venus, so things were pretty good for Cancerians. And you also had Venus and Jupiter were pretty close to a sextile of each other. So I'm hoping that over the last couple of days things were quite good, and you were generally quite happy with the way things going. Things weren't necessarily spectacular, but there was plenty of scope for action and progress. And now, Moon moving into Gemini, that does create a bit of a change. On one hand, you perhaps feel that you want to, slow down a bit. You don't have to do, everything at once, and there's always a time for reflection. But the Moon is making a conjunction to Uranus, and it's making a trine to Pluto. And this could indicate that some of the action is taking place on an inner level, on your own, with Moon conjunct Uranus and Moon trine Pluto. There are perhaps realizations. You're starting to see things in a new way, and it's quite unexpected, and something occurs to you that perhaps hadn't occurred to you before, and you're not quite sure how to respond. I mean, it's for the best. I mean, it's always good to have knowledge, not to be in the dark. And so something is lit up. The light has been shone on something. That's because that's Uranus. Uranus can be a planet of awareness, but it can be unwelcome awareness. And it's not even necessarily slow awareness. You just think about something for a bit, and then it's then completely obvious. But the question then is, what do you do about it? What is the best response? And you might find that other people are not necessarily very helpful. Mars is making a sesquiquadrate to Saturn, like yesterday, and of course Saturn is the ruler of Capricorn, your opposite sign, and so Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn, it might mean that certain people are difficult. They might be trying their best, but there's something holding them back, and if you try to involve them in what you're doing and what you're thinking, they might be distracted. They might take the view that they've got their own things to worry about, and they don't want to worry about you. So maybe Cancer, it's just a question of just allowing yourself to work things out on your own. And I think that for the moment, I don't think that you need any help. Leo, you can see how things are working. It's quite obvious to you, and because things are obvious to you, you're probably quite happy to engage in some kind of discussion. I mean, there are things that need to be talked about, and you do at the moment, Leo, just have a natural ability to communicate. Wherever you are, you can say what's on your mind, and to an extent, Leo, you can articulate what other people can't. So it might be that everyone is thinking the same thing, but you're the only one who can really talk about it. It seems obvious. If something is becoming clear, you want to you want to tell everyone about it. And when you speak, with sincerity, you're likely to get a good response. And the reason you get a good response is because you're telling everyone what you know anyway, what they know anyway. And also today there is this conjunction between the Moon and Uranus, and with this Moon-Uranus conjunction, you have the ability to stand out. That's always important if you're a Leo, to stand out. You don't want to be ignored, and you've certainly got things that you can communicate, as I've just been saying, and people will listen, and you can maybe stir things up. Some people have got complacent, so if you are socializing, you're meeting people, whether it's one-to-one or in a group, you can change things. You can change the emphasis, and I think that you can change the emphasis, very much for the better. Also, Leo, it might be a time when you need to be thinking about, where you are going. And when I say where you are going, I'm talking about something which goes beyond mere ambition. It's about your broad future. Where do you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years time? How are you addressing that future? And perhaps recently you haven't been addressing his future. Well, I think you might have been, because now that Uranus is moving into Gemini. So with Uranus moving into Gemini, you've started to address his future, and perhaps you've had some changes of mind. When you think about where you want to be in 5 or 10 years' time, this Moon-Uranus conjunction is perhaps making you think again, and you may be looking at what's happening around you, where trends are taking you, and you might be thinking, well, this isn't quite good enough, and you perhaps need to, ever so slightly realign. And this realignment process could potentially be facilitated by another person. You hear what someone else is planning, what someone else is thinking about, and you then realize that something has changed, and you could just be ever so slightly behind the times. But now with this Moon conjunct Uranus, it's a good opportunity to really sort of update yourself and start to really move into the future. And so you can, very much do this. And yes, you may get a person's help. So have a busy day, particularly on a social level. If you possibly can. I think that you can really enjoy other people's company and benefit from it. And ideally, you should be looking for people who are different, who can give you a different view. Spending time with the same old people, well, that might be a bit of a waste. Try to give yourself as much social variety as possible. Virgo, you're feeling that things are fine, but they could be better. And it's a reminder, Virgo, that you want more. And I'm thinking particularly of your ambitions. You're quite capable of being ambitious, having big targets that you want to achieve as quickly as possible. Although you are a Virgo, and because you are a Virgo, you're quite capable of being reasonable. You don't want to push yourself too far too quickly. You do understand that everything takes time. Yet, with Uranus in Gemini, and it's been in Gemini for some time now, I think since the beginning of July. It stays in Gemini until the beginning of November, before going retrograde into Taurus, and then next year it will go back into Gemini. But with a Moon-Uranus conjunction in Gemini, and the Moon making a trine to Pluto, Virgo, this just reminds you of what needs to be done, and you might think that you just have to do something. It's a Friday, it's the end of a week. What should you be doing? And so some Virgos might want to sort a lot out very quickly. And if you take this approach, then I think that might be best. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with being in a hurry, provided that you don't take things too quickly. I mean, a Moon-Uranus conjunction, it can be explosive, and it can represent things happening that you aren't fully able to deal with because it's all happening too quickly. But sometimes a sudden event, something you weren't expecting, something you hadn't planned for, can help you move quickly. Your first inclination might be to panic and think that this is something completely disastrous, but it may not be disastrous at all. It might actually be a big opportunity. So perhaps Taurus, particularly, sorry, not Taurus, Virgo, perhaps Virgo, if you are working, for example, something could happen, or maybe if you're looking for a job, something could happen, something that could happen that you might be able to take advantage of. It might be, for example, that something happens to another person or another organization, someone gets themselves into trouble, maybe you can do something about it, maybe you can help. So it might be, a great day for offering your assistance. Perhaps if someone or something is experiencing a crisis, perhaps you can intervene and also keep your cool. I think you can keep your cool if you make the effort. Now, an aspect we do have, which is kind of rather different from all of this, is a biquintile between Mercury and Neptune. So Mercury is 144 degrees from Neptune. Mercury is your ruler, and this Mercury-Neptune biquintile is something you are trying to create, or you could be trying to create. And it might be the case, Virgo, that in some situations it can be useful to hide your intentions. You don't necessarily want to be completely open and upfront. Now, the Moon-Uranus conjunction might be encouraging you to be open and upfront, but a bit of subtlety might be useful, and you might want to just make an effort to slightly muffle your motivations and your intentions. When I say muffle so that people can't hear them, people can't see them, so people don't fully know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And one reason for that is you don't want to raise suspicions. Now, this is especially the case if you're involved in anything competitive, where your gain could be another person's loss. In this case, Mercury quintile Neptune, might help you to sort of weave a certain web of deception. Not the kind of deception where anyone gets hurt, but the kind of deception that is sometimes required to protect yourself. Because if people knew what you were planning on doing, they might use that against you, or you might lose your advantage. So that is one way in which the Mercury biquintile Neptune could operate. I mean, it could also have a spiritual dimension. It could be about you making a special effort to tune into your spirituality, tune into something which is beyond yourself. And if you do that, if you're in the mood for that, I think that your preparation and your thoughts can be managed, in a very sort of effective way. And if you're looking for something sort of elevating on a spiritual level, and you make the effort, I think you, in the end, you can find what you're looking for to some extent. But of course, if one's talking about spiritual quests, one must be prepared for surprises. And if we get what we expect, well, then that's not really anything to do with spiritual elevation, because I suppose if you're trying to move to the next level and you have a goal, your goal is defined from a perspective of a lower level, and when you get to the new level, well, you may realize that previous goal is meaningless, and that something else is more important, if that makes any sense. Libra. We perhaps need to start by talking about Venus, which is your ruling planet. Now, Venus is currently making an opposition to Saturn. Now, this opposition between Venus and Saturn is exact over the weekend, and already you may be starting to feel it. So how would you feel Venus opposition Saturn? Well, it might not be great. And some Librans may be starting to feel a bit sorry for themselves, or they just might be aware that certain things are just, holding you up, and you're not quite sure what it's all about, but it's just maybe difficult to be positive. Now, there is something positive to say about this, because Venus, having made this opposition to Saturn, which does become exact over the weekend, it does then move into your sign. I think, Monday, Tuesday, depending on your time zone, Venus moves into Libra, and that's going to create a big change. That's going to, I think, really make you feel good about yourself. And I think a lot of the negativity that you might be feeling at the moment should just drop away. So, however, bad things might be, they can't be that bad. Things are going to get better, but are things that bad? Well, the moon is moving out of Taurus and into Gemini, and I think that's something which is a plus. When the moon is in Taurus, if you're a Libra, it's not great. Taurus and Libra, well, they're both ruled by Venus, but from a Libran perspective, Taurus can be a sign that is just perhaps too self-obsessed, is too intense, and it's a big relief when the moon moves out of Taurus and into Gemini. So with the moon moving into Gemini, with the moon making a conjunction to Uranus in Gemini today, I think that things can happen, and things that can happen which can make things a lot better. So what are we talking about? Well, it could just be a question of perspective. If you look at things in one way, things might not seem great. You look at things in another way, well, it's fine. It's better than fine. So perhaps, Libra, it's a time where you need to be really elevating yourself. You need to go beyond your current situation and your current worries and see things differently. And Moon conjunct Uranus can indicate something happening, quite suddenly. It might be just a sudden insight, especially as the moon is not just conjunct Uranus, it's trine Pluto. So we've got sort of air signs in action, Pluto in Aquarius, Moon-Uranus conjunction in Gemini, and of course, Sun is in Libra. And so you haven't quite got a grand trine there, but there are representative planets in all three air signs. And I think that as the moon moves through Gemini, not just today, but over the weekend, you can see how things could work, how things could really sort of work in your favor. And it may be that this Venus opposition Saturn, if we try to be positive about it, may allow you to see what needs to be done. You might not like what needs to be done, but you can see that there is a list. And if you go down that list, if you do get everything done, there can be a real sense of relief. So, Libra, as far as today is concerned, it just may be, all about perspective. And if you get the right perspective, then, I think that, things do look good. And don't allow anyone to get you down. Mars is making a sesquiquadrate to Saturn, and Mars may represent another person, someone feeling sorry for themselves, someone who wants to involve everyone else in their misery. And if you come across these kinds of people, and they do exist, maybe sometimes I'm one of them, but if you involve yourself with such people, they could get you down. And you need to be able to identify miserable people. And if you have once you have identified these people, you need to adopt the right perspective, and you don't want to get drawn into another person's miserable world. That would be quite unnecessary. Scorpio. Mars is still making a sesquiquadrate to Saturn. And, this sesquiquadrate Saturn, obviously something I talked about in my video for yesterday, for Thursday, but it can be a difficult aspect. And, with Mars making this aspect, it can bring you down. It can make you think that, everything is difficult, that it's sort of hard work. even having fun is hard work. And so you shouldn't allow this sesquiquadrate to sort of get you down. You should remember that Mars is in Scorpio. Mars is very strong in Scorpio, and so perhaps you should look at this sesquiquadrate Saturn as a way of somehow structuring yourself, of making something permanent. So if something is working well, you enjoy doing something, maybe you do have to do some work to make sure that it is just a permanent part of your life. So that might be a constructive way of looking at this aspect between Mars and Saturn. Also with Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn, do consider the impact you are having on others. Mars is in your sign, and so with Mars in your sign, you're someone who is difficult to ignore, and what you say, what you do, even what you think can have an impact. Your aura cannot be ignored, and of course with Mars opposite sesquiquadrate Saturn, there is a danger that if you are too self-obsessed, then you could bring everyone else down to your level, and you could make everyone else feel miserable. It really could happen, but it needn't happen. You have to be open and honest to an extent, but you have to first of all be open and honest with yourself, and you have to have a keen awareness of the impact you have on other people. And I think perhaps, Scorpio, it's going to be important that you don't take things too seriously. If you do take things seriously, and you can, Scorpio is a serious sign, but if you do take things too seriously, you could just go down into a spiral, and you could take other people down with you. And again, that's absolutely not something you want to do. And there is a conjunction between the Moon and Uranus today, and this Moon conjunct Uranus can be about a surprise realization which allows you to see things in a way that is completely different. So perhaps you start to see a lot of negative stuff going on, and you start to be quite pessimistic, and as a Scorpio you could just get stuck in a particular view, you could brood. But Moon Uranus should represent a sudden change. That Moon Uranus is in Gemini, in a two-bodied sign, suddenly moving from one thing to another. So it's possible that you take something that on the surface appears to be quite negative, nothing you're very pleased about, and then you rework it and you reimagine it, and it becomes something completely different. It becomes something completely opposite, and it can be really sort of invigorating. And furthermore, it can set you free. Freedom matters for you, Scorpio. You don't need to be stuck, and perhaps that's what you need to be aware of. However stuck you feel, that's not the way it need end. And there is a way of breaking free, and it can happen really very quickly. And it might be just a change of attitude. It might be a change of circumstance. You just suddenly do something, and what seemed to be, not so long ago, a really big problem, something you were completely worried about, just suddenly becomes nothing. And so you can really find your freedom today, Scorpio, however you see freedom, but it is yours for the taking. Sagittarius. We have the Moon in Gemini. It's in your opposite sign, and so with the Moon in Gemini conjunct Uranus, that may say something about other people and how other people behave and how other people respond. You shouldn't assume that people are going to behave in any particular way, because there is always the possibility of something happening that you just hadn't expected. And so be prepared for a surprise, and also Uranus can be a very stubborn and willful planet, and some people do not want to compromise. They're so into their view that they're just not prepared to listen. I mean, okay, yeah, sure, they'll listen, but that doesn't mean to say that they'll do anything about it. That they can listen as much as they like, as much as you want them to listen, but still they'll still go and do whatever they were planning on doing in the first place. So don't try too hard to be persuasive, because I'm not convinced that you'll be entirely successful. And perhaps with Moon conjunct Uranus, you should make an effort to understand why other people have the view they have. It's all very well making assumptions. You look at someone's behavior and you make assumptions about who they are, but do you really understand them? Do you really understand their motivations? And perhaps with Moon conjunct Uranus, you have a chance to gain some understanding. And you have to be open-minded. Who knows what you are going to find. You might find something that isn't necessarily very nice, and that is possible. So you need to be open-minded about that. And at the moment, many Sagittarians are able to deal with things which aren't very nice. Other people maybe run away from it, but the reality of things, and perhaps it's a kind of day where you can look at something that is difficult, unpleasant, and it's going to stay difficult and unpleasant. You're not hiding from it, but the more you look at it, the more you see possibilities, and perhaps you're going to be good at working with things which are difficult, which other people shy away from, and in the process, you can create something amazing. So it could be that what do they say? Where there's muck, there's brass. So where there are things. Do they say that in Yorkshire? Where there's muck, there's brass. Where there's muck, there's brass. So where you've got something difficult and unpleasant, nasty, that's perhaps where the opportunity lies. So of course you have to be careful. You don't want to be so obsessed with opportunity that you get yourself into trouble. And I just noticed that I forgot to turn the chart, Sagittarius. So my apologies for that. I will turn the chart now just to show you that I haven't forgotten that I am indeed, or at least I was talking about Sagittarius, but I'll try not to forget in future. Capricorn, you may feel that there is work to be done, that things haven't been sorted out as well as they should have been. You would have liked to have got things done earlier, but for one reason or another it didn't happen, and now it's Friday, and you may be somewhat annoyed with yourself, maybe annoyed with other people. Things should have run better. Time has kind of caught up with you, but don't worry. Just because it's the end of a week doesn't mean that it's too late. And I think that this Friday you can get things done quickly, perhaps more quickly than you'd expect. Not just Friday. I think into Saturday as well. And we do have the Moon moving into Gemini, making a conjunction to Uranus, making a trine to Pluto, and these aspects allow you to organize things very quickly. And so do think about what you haven't done, what you would have liked to have done, and then just go through it. Go through the list, and don't worry too much about upsetting people. Perhaps it may be a time where you have to spring a few surprises, and also demonstrate that there are certain things you might be obsessed about, But you're obsessed with things for a good reason, because they have to be got out of the way. You don't want to have them sort of hanging over into next week. That is something you really want to avoid. So in some respects, Capricorn, you can be a typical Capricorn. Capricorns can be very focused, can be very down to earth, and you can get through things, one step at a time, and eventually getting to your destination. And at the same time, don't allow yourself to be knocked off course. I mean, the moon with this conjunction to Uranus can say something about your approach. It can also say something about other people's approach, and moon conjunct Uranus can represent a person or maybe a situation that behaves in a way that you weren't necessarily expecting. And at face value, it seems that they could be very disruptive. They could sort of disrupt schedules that you had thought you'd worked out, and they're asking you to break your schedule, but you don't have to. Not at all. You can hold firm. And it's also a time, Capricorn, where you can think about the things that might have been restricting you. And it's a similar message what I was saying yesterday, and I think the day before as well. Some Capricorns have felt restricted, that you were perhaps having to do things according to another person's plan, or that you'd made commitments and you didn't really enjoy these commitments, and you didn't really feel that these commitments were fair, really. And now you have a chance to get away from them. So if you feel restrained, if you feel that something is holding you back, it's not a permanent state of affairs, or rather it needn't be a permanent state of affairs. And if you want to assert your individuality, then I think you very much can. Additionally, if there's been a worry, something that's just been worrying you for a long time, just really been bothering you, and you haven't really wanted to find out too much about it because you were afraid about what you might find, then it's possible that you can take action, or you can get information which makes you realize that this worry just wasn't such a big deal, that it may even be that you can sort of move beyond it and create a situation where you feel relieved that really things weren't so bad. So I really do think that there is an optimistic message there. Now, another thing going on, Capricorn, and it's not just about today, it's into the weekend, is that Venus is making an opposition to Saturn. And Venus opposition Saturn may say something about you and other people, say something about relationships. And if Venus is opposition Saturn, it might be that you and someone else are at odds with one another, or that you might respond to someone in a way that isn't very constructive. So Venus in Virgo may be about a person with perhaps a particular view of the world, with a particular set of ideas, and they come across you, and you are quite capable of stopping someone in their tracks. And the question then is, are you doing it right? You could be quite cruel and harsh. You tell someone what you feel. You can be very critical, and not everyone can deal with criticism. And additionally, you might be putting a damper on someone's enthusiasm, for no reason at all. So that is a possibility. Venus opposition Saturn could additionally be someone is trying to get close to you who is very different from you, and you put them off. So, that Venus-Saturn opposition really does need to be considered. And I will be talking more about this opposition when I do my horoscope for the weekend, because I think that it does matter. Aquarius. It's nice that we've got stuff going on in air signs, because we've got the moon moving into Gemini. And of course, the moon, when it moves into Gemini, it makes a conjunction to Uranus. It also makes a trine to Pluto. And of course, we've got the sun in Libra. So you could say that we've got 4 planets in air signs. And from an Aquarian perspective, that has surely, got to be, good news. And so, today, Friday, and into the weekend, with the moon moving into Gemini, I think that you have an opportunity to be yourself, and most importantly, to be original. Originality always matters for Aquarians, and I think that at the moment you can be particularly original. You can do things that are unusual, that might be groundbreaking. And you don't have to be too self-conscious. If something feels right to you, then, it probably is right. And if something is exciting, then, you're really going to want to go for it. And excitement really does matter. And, don't forget Moon trine Pluto. Pluto is in your sign, and Pluto is making a trine to Uranus. So the moon sort of picks up on it all, and you can really create change and enjoy creating change. And I think that is really very important. Again, not just Friday, not just today, Friday, but as you move into the weekend. And you shouldn't think that anything is holding you back, because it's not. And it may be a time when you can look at something which appears to be holding you back, but when you look at it closely, you realize that it's not holding you back at all. That you can really establish your identity and make it clear that freedom is important to you. And this has been a growing theme, freedom, in the Aquarian chart. So now is the time to show the world who you are and what you want to do, and perhaps constraint had been useful in the past. There's always room for discipline, but discipline can be taken too far. And now is the time to be yourself, and not to worry too much about the kind of impact you are having. Though I should point out that there is a sesquiquadrate between Mars and Saturn, and so, of course, Saturn is your ruler, and Mars is well placed in Scorpio. So, what could this Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn be about? If it manifests, it could be something to do with your work, or the way you are constructing your ambitions and having to deal with perhaps authority figures. And it may be a clash, and perhaps someone is being assertive, for example, at work, and they have a very clear idea about the way things should be done, and you're not happy with it. You're not comfortable with the situation, and that you do not have to put up with this, because it is a great time for expressing your freedom, expressing your individuality. But perhaps the question is, with this Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn, is that yes, you have the opportunity to be free. It's not a time where you want to be held back. On the other hand, should you express your freedom in every single situation? Should you really want to reinforce your identity, who you are, everywhere? Perhaps not. And maybe you should choose your battles carefully. Don't assume a battle everywhere, and some battles shouldn't be fought. You have to sort of think strategically, and maybe that's what that Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn is all about. You need to think about the longer term, and just because you can assert yourself doesn't necessarily mean that you always should assert yourself. Pisces, you are probably feeling that you don't want to take too many risks. Things can go wrong. I mean, and that might be, the sort of Pisces perspective. Maybe it's because of your sensitivity, the fact that you're a water sign, and you can see how things are going, and you can imagine how things might turn out, and you perhaps know that if you were to stick your neck out, you could run into difficulties. So Pisces, your inclination today, Friday, and into the weekend is quite possibly to retreat into somewhere that you just know, where you are just familiar with what is going on, and you're not really in the mood for surprises. And that seems to be the sensible approach. But just because you try to avoid surprises doesn't mean that the surprises, won't happen. I mean, surprises can happen anywhere. I mean, surprises can happen, for example, in your own home, when you're with people you know really well. You think everything is sorted out. You think you're on familiar territory. And even then, something can happen that you just absolutely weren't expecting. And so, Pisces, you need to be ready for that. You just shouldn't assume that things are necessarily going to go to plan. You shouldn't assume that people who in the past have been completely reliable will continue to be reliable. Just something might happen, and you need to be ready for that, and you need to be prepared. I'm not saying you have to pack your bags just in case. It's not quite like that. But you must always consider how things could go wrong. Indeed, how things could become unpleasant. Because unpleasantness is always just below the surface over the next day or two. And you might be trying to be nice. You might be associated with nice people. But still, something could happen that you just hadn't allowed for. And so, Pisces, you perhaps have to be strong. I mean, I'm not saying anything bad is going to happen. I mean, part of what I have to do here, when I do my forecast of the 12 signs, is just look at everything. Just look at what could go wrong. Even if there's very little chance of it actually happening, I do have to look at the worst case scenario. So there is a worst case scenario here. And the worst case scenario is disruption, surprises, and surprises which you really didn't want, because I don't think fundamentally you want surprises. So what is the right approach? Well, you could take the view that if something is undermined, if something sort of blows up, it is because it's all going on in your own unconscious. At an unconscious level, you are looking for change. On a conscious level, you don't want change at all. So under those circumstances, Pisces, it might be best if you go out of your way to create the change, rather than you being the subject of change, be at the receiving end of change. Why don't you try to create the change yourself? Because I think at some level that things can't go on forever, that something needs to give. And rather than wait for it to happen, make it happen and announce it. This is not good enough. You want things to not just change, but perhaps to be completely overturned. And it might be that some people are taking you for granted, have assumed you'll always be there, assumed you'll always behave in a particular way, and perhaps your job is to confound those expectations, do the very last thing that anyone else is expecting, and that way you become the center of change, and that way you're in control. So those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And now it's time to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Friday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 7, which is the army. I mean, that's come up quite recently. And the army is about action, perhaps collective action, because it is the army, being part of a group, being part of an organized group with particular goals. I mean, that's what the army is all about. They might be passive goals like defense, but there might be more active goals like trying to achieve particular targets. And so many of you might feel that you are part of a group and that you have a responsibility, a specific responsibility, because this is the nature of armed forces. People have a job to do and they are under someone else of higher rank, and maybe people of lower rank below you. So that may be one way of looking at the army. But I always, have a difficulty with this hexagram, because is it really realistic to think that on some Friday, some random Friday, you're just part of some sort of wider group involved in some kind of battle? That's probably not very realistic. But I think that things are made clearer when we look at the bottom line. And so the bottom line moves. And the bottom line represents the beginning. It's the beginning of an enterprise. And at the beginning of any enterprise, you have to know what you're doing. Because, when you think about the army, you think about targets. You think about, what is victory? What is defeat? How do we define all of this? And so you have to have a clear idea about what you're trying to do and the approach you're going to take. And it's very important that you have an idea. There is excellent preparation and excellent discipline. All of this really does matter. So if you or other people are involved in a project, you have to make sure that the preparations are as absolutely good as possible, and you need to know what you're doing. And so if you can do that, then your chances of success are maximized. So, we have a moving line at the bottom. That means that we move to a second hexagram, and the hexagram we move to is hexagram number 19, which is approach. And so this is kind of the development of the army. The army gets itself together and starts to approach something. And this might say something about our role. We are perhaps in a position of leadership, and perhaps we are leading maybe by what we are doing, by the example we are setting. So we can get towards our goal, having properly prepared ourselves. We can move forward, and we can reach a point where perhaps we can at the very least see our targets. But I'm not saying we're going to reach our targets, and it may be that it's just about generally improving the situation and defining the problem and starting to solve it. So this Friday it's constructive, but I don't think we're going to be able to complete everything, and this might hint that we might not be able to finish something until the weekend, or perhaps into next week. So I want to finish by looking at this conjunction between the Moon and Uranus. Now, Moon-Uranus conjunctions are pretty common. They happen once a month. And here is the chart for the conjunction between the Moon and Uranus. And so where's it gone? Here it is. Moon conjunct Uranus. So this conjunction between the Moon and Uranus takes place at 7:48 a.m. on Friday. So that means that if you're in California, Hawaii, Alaska, the Moon-Uranus conjunction will actually take place late on Thursday. So, why am I bothering with this Moon-Uranus conjunction? Why am I talking about it? Well, I think it's a good idea to think about what Moon-Uranus conjunctions are about, and when you've got a Moon-Uranus conjunction, you might expect dramatic things to happen in that window. I mean, how big is that window? So if you take a 3-degree orb, so 3 degrees either side, so that would roughly be between 6 hours before the conjunction is exact and 6 hours after, that approximate window. And I mean, it could be longer. If you take a 5-degree orb, then you may be talking about, off the top of my head, 6 hours, 7, 8, I don't know. Might be a whole day when that Moon-Uranus conjunction is in operation. And the moon is about emotional responses. It's about how we respond. And what's the first thing we do when we hear something, when we get some news? When you've got Moon conjunct Uranus, you want to do something about it. You want to act in a dramatic way. And of course, with this Moon-Uranus conjunction, it takes place in Gemini. So with Moon-Uranus conjunction in Gemini, it might be what we say, just how we respond. The first thing we write, the first thing we say, the first thing we think. I mean, it's not like a Moon-Uranus conjunction in a fire sign. It needn't necessarily be about action. I mean, you could say that Moon-Uranus conjunction in an earth sign could be about moving material things. Its Moon-Uranus conjunction is perhaps more about ideas and what we say, although it could represent an event, and we do have to think about what else is going on at the same time as this Moon-Uranus conjunction. And you can see that Mars is making a very close sesquiquadrate to Saturn. So I talked about the Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn aspect yesterday, and this aspect takes place Thursday, Friday. We're right in that conjunction at the moment, and so perhaps having a Mars Saturn conjunction at the same time as a Moon-Uranus conjunction, the Moon-Uranus conjunction may trigger the potential of that Mars-Saturn sesquiquadrate. And I think that Mars-Saturn sesquiquadrate is potentially quite an unfortunate aspect. And it could be about bad things going on. We often connect Mars and Saturn with death and destruction and just feeling that things are absolutely not working. And then Moon conjunct Uranus, we want something to happen. So we've got to break free. And if you've been looking at some of the things I've been saying earlier in the video, Saturn is square the Jupiter-Uranus midpoint. In fact, both Mars and Saturn are on the Jupiter-Uranus midpoint. And so this is a very frustrating time, but also a time where people are not prepared to put up with frustration, and people want to break free. And breaking free sounds great. Breaking the chains. I think yesterday when I was in my Capricorn video horoscope for Thursday, I think I mentioned the devil, because the devil is in the tarot card. The devil, in the devil, of course, you see the lovers with their chains, and you're always told that the lovers could so easily break free from these chains. They could break free from the devil if they wanted to, but they don't want to. But in this case, I think that some people are so desperate to break free that they don't care what they do. And it might be people in a difficult situation, perhaps an impossible situation, having to do something extreme, which may be sort of completely inadvisable. And it's all happening at the same time as the moon is making a conjunction to Uranus. And I think that this Moon-Uranus conjunction could be could be problematic. When you think of some of the people situations that are might be aspected by it. For example, with this Moon-Uranus conjunction, we could look at the chart of our favourite country, Ukraine. So there's Ukraine's chart, and Ukraine has its sun at 0 degrees 56 Virgo. So with the sun at 0 degrees 56 Virgo, this Moon-Uranus conjunction is at 1 degree Virgo. So this Moon-Uranus conjunction is making an exact square to Ukraine's sun. It's also making a square to NATO's ratification chart sun. So it's quite possible that this Moon-Uranus conjunction could manifest somewhere in Ukraine or Russia, someone trying to do something. It might be that Ukraine, with this Moon-Uranus conjunction, is going to want to pull off a spectacular, as Ukraine likes to do. Okay, it's true, Ukraine is losing the war, and it all seems pretty hopeless, but Ukraine does like to do this these sort of events, these attacks. Sometimes it's an assassination or attacking a Kiev bridge or just something to get attention. And so maybe that's how Moon-Uranus could work. It could work the other way. It could be that something happens to Ukraine that is above and beyond what has already happened. So I think that this Moon-Uranus conjunction, particularly as it happens at the same time as the Mars sesquiquadrate Saturn, could affect that part of the world. And certainly any country, person who has perhaps a personal planet at 0 degrees Gemini or 0 degrees mutable might be impacted by this Mars-Uranus conjunction. So I wanted now firstly to look at a couple of people who had Moon-Uranus conjunctions, just to get an idea, and then I wanted to look at some Moon-Uranus conjunction events. So, just a few people. Moon-Uranus conjunction would be the sort of classic configuration for a terrorist. It's kind of not surprising that sort of Andreas Baader, who founded the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany, he had a Moon-Uranus conjunction in Gemini. So he very much sort of picks up on this Moon-Uranus conjunction. He's not going to pick up on it because he's been dead since the late 1970s. But you can see how if you've got Moon-Uranus in Gemini, a conjunction in Gemini, you might be a terrorist and you might be interested in the ideas behind terrorism. It's not just blowing things up for the sake of it. Andreas Baader had a philosophy. He didn't like the inequality in Germany that he saw in the 60s, and there were other things bothering him. In the end, the Baader-Meinhof gang got very concerned about the Palestinian cause. So nothing changes, does it? So that's one way in which the Moon-Uranus conjunction can happen, can work out. And on the theme of bombings, Bomber Harris, who the British Air Marshal, who was in charge of Britain's strategic bombing campaign of Germany. The man who said, famously said about Germany, he said, what did he say? Sow the wind and reap the whirlwind, talking about Germany, that this is what, they had it coming. And so he was a great believer in bombing Germany out of existence. And so he had, at noon, I don't know what time he was born, but at noon he had a Moon-Uranus conjunction within 3 degrees. So I think he certainly had a Moon-Uranus conjunction of some nature in Scorpio. Scorpio is all about revenge. So there's different ways in which Scorpio can work. But the idea of taking the view, you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind, Germany had it coming to them, that would be a very Scorpionic way of looking at things. And also it's what he said, his Mercury was opposition Uranus and the Moon was tied into it. So I think that's a good example of Moon-Uranus working. And people it may not be quite so clear. If you're Canadian, then your Prime Minister has a conjunction between the Moon and Uranus. So Moon-Uranus in Virgo. Perhaps we haven't fully seen the Moon-Uranus conjunction in Mark Carney's horoscope. He is Prime Minister, and this conjunction is tied in with Pluto. And so now that he's Prime Minister, he's capable of doing things. He's capable of getting agitated and perhaps doing things, unexpectedly. He comes over. He's trying to be a sort of a stable banker, now Prime Minister of Canada. But is he quite as stable as he claims to be? Quite as stable as the Canadian people think he is? And it may not take much to stir that Moon-Uranus conjunction. I mean, he's got a great chart. I mean, don't underestimate Mark Carney's chart, and that Jupiter in Taurus, right on the ascendant, is is pretty good, particularly as it's in mutual reception to Venus, and he's got Venus sextile Jupiter. He's got an amazing chart, but I wonder how that conjunction between the Moon and Uranus is actually working. And someone else with Moon-Uranus conjunction is Scott Ritter. Remember, Scott Ritter, former United Nations weapons inspector, don't have his time of birth. He will have a Moon-Uranus conjunction certainly within 6 degrees. I mean, at noon, that Moon-Uranus conjunction in Scott Ritter's chart was exact, but so his moon could be anywhere between, I don't know, approximately 17, 18 Leo and the end of Leo. So he's got a Moon-Uranus conjunction in some form. So if you look at his interviews, he's quite a very definite person. He's very clear about his opinions, and he doesn't mince his words. And he is not afraid of standing out in terms of his opinion. So that may be a way in which Moon-Uranus conjunction in Leo works. He is an individual. He went against the narrative of, Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, and that potentially cost him quite a lot. I mean, he of course had all sorts of legal troubles. I mean, I don't know whether those pursuing him were encouraged by the fact that he was going against the narrative, and of course, perhaps it was a way of discrediting him. And now in the Ukraine war, he's very, very clear about what's going on, and again, not mincing his words. So that would be a way in which a Moon-Uranus conjunction is working. Of course, in terms of Ukraine, he is quite adamant that Ukraine is going to lose, and he always has been adamant, and he said other stuff about Russia and Ukraine which is completely against the mainstream narrative. And then there's Ursula von der Leyen. Ursula von der Leyen, she again don't have a time of birth for Ursula von der Leyen. Like Scott Ritter, she has a Moon-Uranus conjunction in Leo, so she's very sure of herself. She's very sure of the rectitude of this war against Ukraine. She will not compromise. It's very definite. And that is how Uranus can work. Particularly in this case, Uranus in a fixed sign, believing one is right, not accepting change. So that's Uranus. Yeah, Uranus is a planet of change and revolution, but if you've got Uranus in your chart conjunct a personal planet, you can be incredibly dogmatic. And also, having Ursula von der Leyen as president of the European Commission, do you really want to have that kind of person as president of the European Commission with Moon conjunct Uranus? Because she, with this leadership role, is kind of encouraging Europe to just get involved in Uranus kind of events. And her Uranus, by the way, is making a sesquiquadrate to the Aries point. So that intensifies her Uranus. I mean, she doesn't seem on the surface to be a particularly Uranus kind of person, but that Uranus is revealing itself all the time, particularly now that we've got NATO and Europe's war against the Ukraine. And one final point, one final person who I don't know much about is Shane Warne. So Shane Warne is, he's dead now. He died of a heart attack, but he died very young of a heart. He was very young when he died, I think, or relatively young. And so he was born in 1969. I don't know when he died, but I think he was in his 40s when he died. He died of a heart attack, and he has Moon conjunct Uranus, and it could be that we're seeing Moon-Uranus conjunction and Moon conjunct Jupiter as well. So it could be that, if you want to be a cricketer, you need to have a certain flair, particularly if you want to be sort of a brilliant cricketer. But he was someone who enjoyed the good life, and he was a sort of high profile celebrity. And I don't really know how that works, but if you're Australian, you might have some insight into how that Moon-Uranus conjunction was working in his life. And then there are a few events, and the first event is rather Mercury going stationary direct. So Mercury went stationary direct on October the 17th, 1929. And what I do in these, when I do these videos, trying to predict what's going to happen, is I look at a moment prior to an event. So taking the exact moment that Mercury went direct on October the 17th, 1929. And the time is for Westminster, but I've set this for New York. So at the exact moment that Mercury went direct, the Moon was conjunct Uranus and Mercury was opposition Uranus. So we had this configuration which is quite powerful. It's not angular. It wasn't angular for New York. Got Chiron conjunct the North Node. So this might be dramatic news, something happening that people weren't expecting. And of course, this was Mercury going direct just before the Wall Street crash, which took place at the end of a month. So if you see Moon-Uranus in this kind of chart, that might be a hint that something might happen. Then you've got to use other astrological techniques to try to work out what exactly the nature of the event might be. I mean, Mars in Scorpio was relatively close to the IC at the time that Mercury went direct, so that might say something about it. So that's one way in which you could look at a Moon-Uranus conjunction and sort of use it. And there may be a military side to the Moon-Uranus conjunction. So here is the horoscope for the moment that the time when France was defeated in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu on May the 7th, 1954. So France had Vietnam as a colony, and in North Vietnam there was an insurgency against the French, and the insurgency just got out of hand, and in the end the French were surrounded in Dien Bien Phu. And this is for the moment, I believe, approximately, I think it happened in the evening of May the 7th. And you can see that there's a Moon-Uranus conjunction, conjunct the South Node. And so Moon-Uranus conjunction in this case is just news. Sudden news happens, and that Moon-Uranus conjunction took place in Cancer, and of course France is a Cancerian country. So if we look at let's look at the Bastille chart, see how that. So if you look at the Bastille chart, the fall of the Bastille. So the sun was at 22 Cancer. So one of the horoscopes of France has the fall of the Bastille was at 22-32 Cancer. So the fall of Dien Bien Phu was, Moon-Uranus conjunction, relatively close to France's sun. And Moon conjunct Uranus might represent the beginning of an operation, a military operation. So Operation Barbarossa, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June the 22nd, 1941, the moon was conjunct Uranus. Now, in this case, it's kind of really interesting because the moon has just made that conjunction to Uranus, and the moon was, technically void of course. So although Operation Barbarossa to begin with was very successful, the Soviet Union took, huge casualties, lost a lot of ground very, very quickly. In the end, the German invasion of the Soviet Union did fail. If you invade Russia, in the end you find Russian troops in your own capital city. That's what Napoleon found, and that's what Germany found. And I think Europe has to be a bit careful about trying to undermine Russia again. So that's Moon Uranus, and of course a surprise event. It wasn't a surprise to some. I think the British warned Stalin, but he decided to ignore the warning. So people knew about it, but it was certainly a surprise for Stalin with that moon conjunct Uranus. And Moon conjunct Uranus. Should you start an enterprise with Moon conjunct Uranus? Should you get married with Moon conjunct Uranus? Probably not. For example, Roman Polanski got married to Sharon Tate with Moon conjunct Uranus, and of course we know what happened there. The following year, Sharon Tate was killed by the Manson gang. So getting married with Moon conjunct Uranus is probably not something you should do. It's true that the sun was Moon trine Sun on its own. That's great to get married with Moon trine Sun. By the way, I don't know exactly when they were married, so I've gone for midday, I'm assuming, but it was around then. So the moon was probably applying to a trine of the sun, or was pretty close to the trine of the sun. So that's great for a marriage. But when you throw in Uranus, when you put the Moon Uranus conjunction there, that's not so good. And yes, so with Moon Uranus conjunction, things can just happen that we weren't expecting, and it just happens. So, for example, the shooting of what's her name, Helena Hutchins, by Alec Baldwin on the set of the film Rust on October the 21st, 2021. So here's the chart. The midheaven was at 1329 Scorpio, the IC was at 1329 Taurus, and there was a Moon-Uranus conjunction on the IC. It just happened. Something went wrong. Alec Baldwin, he fired this gun, he thought it had a blank, it didn't have a blank, and Helena Hutchins got killed. And so that, I'm afraid, is a very classic Moon-Uranus event. And Moon-Uranus is a configuration indicating accidents. So the Moon-Uranus conjunction took place at the time of the San Marino Grand Prix in 1994, when Ayrton Senna was killed. And here is a chart of Ayrton Senna's death. He was incredibly famous Brazilian racing car driver. He was really iconic, major celebrity, and this is the chart of his death in Imola in Italy. And so there you have Moon conjunct Uranus. And finally, last year we had the Southport stabbings, which was a really dramatic event in the UK. Where someone of sort of African origin, he was born in Cardiff, but he went into this place where these girls were having some themed Taylor Swift meeting. I don't know, they were very young, these girls, but he went and started stabbing them. And so here's a chart for the stabbings in Southport. Again, Moon-Uranus conjunction. Uranus pretty close to Algol. So that is one way of looking at Moon-Uranus, just something that one wasn't expecting, something that had no reason, no logic. And so when it's conjunct Algol, and then you have to think about how people respond to it. So there's this woman, Lucy Connolly, who tweeted about it, and she spent 31 months in prison because of her tweet. And she didn't, I think at the time, she didn't fully know what was going on, but her tweet was considered to be sufficiently provocative for her to, she pleaded guilty for her to go to prison for 31 months, and then she got released, and she became something of a cause célèbre in the UK. And so here's a chart for her tweet, which happened, of course, after the event. I think she tweeted around 8:30 on the evening of the Southport stabbing, and she took it down within 3 hours. But there for that chart, there's Moon conjunct Uranus. So Moon conjunct Uranus is not just about some terrible event like the stabbing, it's also about how you respond. And that's a way in which you can look at Moon-Uranus conjunctions. It's about how we respond to an event, how we respond to an emotional input. So that's it with Moon conjunct Uranus. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, I would be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.